A thin fog lingered in the air of the forest as the moon hung high, casting a pale light over the jagged, dark trees that stretched toward the sky. The village of Strathmore had always been surrounded by whispers, old tales that no one dared question. There was a force in the woods, ancient and powerful, that no one fully understood. Some said it was a curse, others a forgotten god, but all agreed it was the source of the strange happenings that marred the village's peaceful existence. Lena was no stranger to the eerie tales of Strathmore. Since childhood, she had heard the stories told in hushed voices around the hearth. They spoke of the ember, the last fire of a forgotten god that would one day return to claim its rightful place in the world. It was said that the fire could give life or take it, depending on who held it. And it was this fir. Her family had lived on the edge of the village for generations, near the forest boundary. Her father had died under mysterious circumstances when she was young, and her mother was never the same after that. All that was left of him was a strange, blackened stone, a relic from the forest that her mother refused to talk about. It had become a family heirloom of sorts, passed down with a warning. Never venture too far into the woods. Never seek the ember. Lena, however, never quite understood the fear. Her mother's warning had only fueled her curiosity. There was something in those woods, something calling to her. And so, when she turned 18, she made her decision. It was time to find the ember, to discover what had happened to her father, to end the curse, if such a thing truly existed. One crisp autumn evening, she ventured into the forest alone. The wind was unnaturally still, and the trees stood in silence, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. She walked deeper into the forest, past the familiar paths and into the heart of it, the place no one dared to go. The deeper she went, the more the air seemed to thicken, the shadows darker and longer. She didn't know how long she had been walking when she first heard it. The faint sound of whispering voices carried on the wind. At first, she thought it was a rustling of leaves, but it was more than that. The voices were ancient, unintelligible, and they seemed to be calling her name. Lena, her heart raced as she continued forward, following the voices as though they were a guiding force. Soon, she came upon a clearing, the trees forming a perfect circle. In the center stood a massive stone altar, its surface carved with intricate symbols that pulsed with a faint, otherworldly glow. And there, upon the altar, lay a small, flickering flame, the ember. Lena felt a surge of awe and fear. The flame was unlike any she had ever seen. It burned with an eerie light, neither hot nor cold, and its color seemed to shift and change with every blink. As she approached, she felt a strange pull in her chest, like a magnetic force drawing her closer. But before she could reach it, a voice echoed through the clearing, deep and resonant. "Do you seek what was lost?" Lena froze. The voice was not human. It was ancient, almost divine, and it filled the air with a heavy, oppressive presence. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward, a being cloaked in dark, flowing robes, with eyes that glowed like molten gold. Its face was a shadow, indistinct, but its voice was unmistakable. "You have come for the ember," the figure said, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "But be warned, child, you cannot control what you do not understand." Lena's hands trembled as she reached for the flame, ignoring the voice. The moment her fingers touched the ember, a blinding light exploded from it, and the world around her seemed to shatter. Her body was overwhelmed by an intense heat, but it didn't burn. Instead, it felt as if her very soul was being torn apart and remade. She fell to her knees, gasping for breath, as the figure spoke once more, its voice a whisper now. "You have chosen the path of the lost. The ember is not a gift. It is a curse. To wield its power is to lose yourself." Lena's vision blurred as the world around her twisted and warped. The clearing disappeared, and in its place, she saw visions of ancient lands, kingdoms long forgotten, cities in flames, and people crying out in terror. She saw her father, but he was not the man she remembered. His eyes were hollow, his face pale and gaunt. And then in an instant, it all disappeared. When Lena opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the clearing. She was in a dark, cold place, surrounded by stone walls. The figure was gone, and the ember was no longer in her hand. She felt as though she had been here before, as though she had always been here. The whispers started again, only this time they were clearer. They spoke of a great power, a forgotten god, and the price of immortality. They told her of those who had come before her, those who had sought the ember and paid the price. And they told her that her journey had only just begun. The last ember was not a flame to be controlled, but a soul to be consumed. And as Lena stood in the cold, dark chamber, she realized the truth. She had not found the ember. The ember had found her. The first time Maya heard the whispers, she thought they were a trick of the wind, soft murmurs that seemed to drift from the very walls of the house, though she could never quite trace their source. It had been a week since they moved into the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a place that had once been home to an eccentric scholar who had disappeared mysteriously decades ago, leaving behind only his cluttered bookshelves and strange artifacts. Maya had always been drawn to the unknown, and the house had intrigued her the moment she stepped inside, its history rich with secrets. But something about it felt wrong. The air in the house was thick, as though the very walls were saturated with memories and regrets, and she often caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, shadows that slipped just out of reach when she turned her head. That night, when the whispers came again, she felt a pull in her chest, a strange compulsion to find their source. They weren't normal sounds, not the groaning of old beams or the creaks of the settling house. These whispers were knowing, as if someone or something had been watching her since she arrived. When she followed the sound to the basement, a room that her husband, Jonah, had warned her to stay away from, her pulse quickened with an instinctual dread. She had always been skeptical of such things, but tonight there was something different about the house, an oppressive heaviness in the air, a darkness that seemed to bleed from the corners of the room. The door creaked as she opened it, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. With each step she took down the narrow, stone staircase, the air grew colder, and the faint glow of an unnatural light seemed to pulse from the far corner of the basement. As she reached the bottom, the sight before her made her freeze in place. An ancient wooden door, cracked and warped with age, stood in the center of the room. It had no handle, no keyhole, only an inscription carved into its surface. To the beyond, the whispering had turned into a low hum, vibrating through her very bones. She knew without a doubt that something was waiting for her on the other side. Maya reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing against the door, and the moment she made contact, the world around her seemed to shift. The walls of the basement faded, and a blinding light surged from the door, pulling her forward as though the very fabric of reality were unraveling around her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out as the floor beneath her feet gave way, and she fell into the blinding light. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the basement, or even in her world. The air was thick with fog, and the sky above was a strange, swirling violet. Nothing like the sky she knew. The ground beneath her was soft, as though she stood on the edge of a great chasm, and far in the distance, towering structures of black stone loomed, their jagged shapes stretching toward an inky sky. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from the very fabric of this new world. Maya's heart raced as she realized she wasn't alone. From the fog emerged figures, tall and cloaked in dark robes, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They moved toward her with a slow, deliberate gait, and as they drew near, she could hear their voices. Not whispers this time, but a unified chant, an ancient language she couldn't understand. Panic gripped her chest as she backed away, but her feet wouldn't move, as if the ground itself was holding her in place. One of the figures raised a hand, and the air around her seemed to crackle, the very atmosphere vibrating with power. Maya could feel the pull of something vast and ancient, as if the very universe itself was watching her. In an instant, she was no longer standing in the foggy realm. The world shifted again, and she found herself standing in a strange, otherworldly library. Shelves upon shelves of dusty tomes stretched infinitely in every direction, the very air saturated with knowledge beyond comprehension. A voice, deep and resonant, filled the room, as if emanating from the books themselves. You have entered the rift, Maya. The veil between worlds is thin here. You are no longer bound by the rules of your reality. Time, space, and life itself bend to our will. The voice seemed to surround her, and she could feel her mind stretching, expanding, trying to absorb the vastness of the knowledge around her. But it was too much, and her vision blurred as the room seemed to close in. A figure appeared in front of her, its form shifting and flickering as if made of shadows. It was tall, humanoid, but not quite human, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, its face a blur of ever-changing features. "Do you wish to know the truth, Maya?" it asked, its voice echoing in her mind. "The truth about the rift, about the world beyond your own? You have crossed the threshold, and now you are part of something greater, something older than you can comprehend. You were chosen." Maya's heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. The weight of its presence was suffocating, and yet she couldn't look away. In that moment, she understood the rift was not just a place, but a doorway, a passage between dimensions, a reality beyond reality. It had been waiting for her, calling her to cross the line between worlds. And now, there was no turning back. The figure reached out, its hand cold and unfeeling, and in an instant, Maya was swept away once more, pulled deeper into the rift, into the unknown, into the void where there was no escape. Remember, the darkness always holds a story. Until the next terrifying tale, stay tuned with Campfire Horror Story.